Now, good evening, everybody, and welcome to today's session of Carvan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative. Today, we have a very special guest, Professor Faisal Devji, joining us from St. Anthony's College, University of Oxford. Good evening, sir. Good morning to you. Unique among his contemporaries, Ambedkar did not presume the existence even of society, let alone a nation in India. And while he did not think that such a society and nation might come into existence in the future, Ambedkar was chiefly interested in the possibility of putting a democratic order in place without them. It was a task that required him to rethink a number of received ideas about democracy, and this lecture will explore the highly original way in which Ambedkar understood interest as a fundamental category of liberal politics. Professor Devji is interested in Indian political thought as well as that of modern Islam. Professor Devji's broader concerns have to do with ethics and violence in a globalized world. He is interested in the role of ideas in history and, in particular, the development of political thought in modern South Asia. He has pursued these interests in his works on Gandhi's theory and practice of nonviolence and on the rethinking of Muslim politics from the late 19th century and into the middle of the 20th. He is also involved in thinking about the fragmentation and attempted reconstruction of such themes in the post Cold War period of globalization and Islamic forms of militancy, providing his preferred site of study. He is the author of Muslim Zion, Pakistan as a Political Idea, and The Impossible Indian Gandhi and the Temptation of Violence. Professor Faisal Devji has held faculty positions at this new school in New York, Yale University, and the University of Chicago, from where he also received his PhD in intellectual history. Professor Devji was junior fellow at the Society of Fellows, Harvard University, and head of graduate studies at the Institute of Ismaili Studies in London, from where he directed postgraduate courses in the Near East and Central Asia. So, without further ado, I would request Professor Devji to proceed with the lecture, and we'll be having some questions and answers from the audience after the lecture. So, I would request everybody who is watching us live to write their questions in the Facebook live chat. We'll be taking them later on. Thank you, sir, for accepting our invitation, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Ishan, and thank you for that exhaustive, or should I say exhausting, introduction. Um, so as you've heard from Ishan, I'm interested in speaking today about the category of interest, which I take to be one of the, if not the most fundamental category of liberal and democratic thought. Now, when we, or historians rather, tend to talk about or write about democracy in a country like India, we tend to go directly to the figure of the nation. What is a nation? Was there a nation in India? Who constituted it? Et cetera, et cetera. And we rarely address the proceduralist principles or categories on which democracy is based, which do not necessarily require the nation to exist. Chief among these is interest, um, because of course, interest defines political units in liberalism and democratic thought more generally, and interests are meant to be represented democratically and finally achieve a kind of agreement with one another in contractual terms. This can happen either below the level of politics in terms of the way in which individuals and groups operate in society, and also, of course, through political institutions, interests, elections, parliaments, representation, contractual agreement, etc. So interest is a figure that spans both the formal political world as well as the ostensibly non-political social world in which we all live. Now, the thing about this figure of interest, without which representation and contract cannot really exist, is that it was disputed in the colonial state or by the colonial state. So Indians were meant to lack interests in many respects. Strangely, they were imbued with interest in an economic sense. That was rarely disputed. But in a political sense, they were refused it. So one of the stereotyped debates on the subject of interest in colonial times had to do with the fact that Indians were not ready for democracy because they were not constituted as interest groups, in the sense that interest groups in a democracy are meant to be changing uh, uh, groups, right? So that a majority, a political majority, one day can become a political minority the other day. These sort of interests are not, as it were, bred in the bone. Uh, so the argument against democracy in India, one of the big arguments against democracy in India had to do with the fact that Indians were identified only by permanent identities, such as caste or community, and not by changing interests. And because they were defined by these permanent identities, they could not really be made into parts of a democracy. Now, what I'm interested in is how Indian political thinkers addressed this sort of objection. They didn't necessarily address it head on, in the sense that they weren't convinced by it, but what they weren't convinced by the argument that interest did not entirely exist in India. But what they were interested in is how to think about these fundamental liberal and democratic categories in different ways. What if interests did not really exist, not just in India, but in other parts of the world? What if they were limited by other forms of social organization and forms of mobilization? How were we to conceive of democracy in these conditions? What Indian thinkers tended to do quite correctly is to link interest to property, because you cannot think about the emergence of interest without thinking about property. The two are tied together. For instance, in the work of Locke, who is one of the major English theorists of the idea of interest, liberal interest. So figures like Gandhi, for instance, would argue that precisely because in India, property had not been generalized to subtend all social relations, that most Indians actually possess no property at all, that the idea of private property had not hegemonized all Indian social relations, therefore interests were fragmentary at best. The problem then before such thinkers was whether to work for an India in which interests were solidified and politics defined, therefore, by interests, or whether to depart the world of interests or to recognize their limited remit. So Ambedkar approaches this debate in a very interesting way, and he does so by arguing that if interest had not become a hegemonic category in Indian society and politics, if you could not see Indian society as being composed or comprised of different interests, it was because caste made interests impossible. And by making interests impossible, it also down the road made nationality impossible. So let me go through his argument, which begins by the statement that the category of interest is captured by upper castes for themselves, and insofar as it is in the hands only of upper castes, only upper castes can be or possess interest, interest is destroyed as a general category. So here are a couple of quotations from his book, What Congress and Gandhi Have Done to the Untouchables of 1945. The isolation and exclusiveness following upon the class structure creates in the privileged classes the antisocial spirit of a gang. It feels it has interests of its own, which it makes its prevailing purpose to protect against everybody, even against the interests of the state. What does Manusmriti show? It shows that the caste system is a legal system maintained at the point of a bayonet. If it has survived, it is due to 1, prevention of the masses from the possession of arms, 2, denying to the masses the right to education, and 3, depriving the masses of the right to property. So you see already Ambedkar's, the lineaments of his argument. What he's saying is that in these 3 examples that he's given us, people, or lower castes in particular, he uses the word masses, interestingly, are deliberately deprived of the possibility of being constituted as interests, that only upper castes are meant to have interests, and therefore interest is a completely restricted category that cannot make a general politics possible. Now, what this does is it leaves lower castes, in Ambedkar's view, in a rather ambiguous position, not simply as victims, but also in some ways as a kind of vanguard of humanity in the form of what Marx would call species being. So let me say something about what I mean here by quoting something else on Ambedkar. This is from his evidence before the Southborough Committee on Franchise as early as 1919. Here is what he says. The untouchables are usually regarded as objects of pity, but they are ignored in any political scheme on the score that they have no interests to protect. And yet their interests are the greatest. Not that they have large property to protect from confiscation, but they have their very persona confiscated. The socio-religious disabilities have dehumanized the untouchables, and their interests at stake are therefore the interests of humanity. The interests of property are nothing before such primary interests. Now, this is a really fascinating statement in which several things happen. First, Ambedkar acknowledges that interests are tied to property. The fact that lower castes are seen not to have property disallows them from forming interest groups or entering into politics. And of course, you will recall that in India, in colonial India, as in Europe, at the time, you could only enter the formal realm of politics, say to vote, if you had some kind of property or educational attainment which served as an equivalent of property. If you didn't have access to property, you were understood as not being sufficiently invested in your society and therefore of being unable to speak for it or to it because you had nothing invested in it. You were too, as it were, radical. You were not constituted as the interest because you had nothing to protect. What Ambedkar says is, yes, lower castes are viewed with pity, but they are excluded from politics because, of course, they are considered not to have any investment in property. On the other hand, precisely because of this and because their very persona, as he puts it, has been confiscated, right? They do not even have control over their own bodies as property. And this goes back to something Locke had said, that your first property is actually yourself in some ways. Because of this confiscation or deprivation, their interests are nothing more nor less than the interests of humanity as such. So you see the, as it were, ambiguity involved here. On the one hand, there is the problem of lower castes not having access to interest and therefore politics. On the other hand, precisely because they have no access, they represent the potential interests of humanity itself. Right? Beside which, Ambedkar tells us, the interests of property are nothing. So the very lack of property and so interest allows Dalits in particular to represent the human race. So what does he make of this situation, which is a bifurcated situation? On the one hand, he complains that lower castes are not constituted as interest. On the other hand, he seems to see that there is actually something quite productive in this situation that is otherwise a disability, that the political potential of the representation of humanity itself might be what is involved in it. So initially what Ambedkar wants to do is think about liberalism without nationality. So when he's talking about interest, he's not talking about the presence of a nation. He doesn't really think it exists precisely because caste has made it impossible, along with other factors such as religion. And what he struggles to do in a work like Annihilation of Caste, that famous speech that remained undelivered in Lahore, was to think about the creation of interest in other ways. And he does so by struggling for the kinds of things that other groups in India, such as the Muslim League, also struggle for: separate electorates and reservations, right? So these are ways of creating interests, if you will, without presuming a nation. They are ways of thinking about the artificial or legal creation of interests where they do not necessarily exist. And what he does in Annihilation of Caste is actually fascinating, because in Annihilation of Caste, the interests that are created actually are not the interests of lower caste so much as of upper caste. You may recall that what he advises in Annihilation of Caste is that the state, the independent Indian state, when it comes into being, should strictly regulate the Brahmin caste and the priesthood in particular, right? So what he recommends there is that Brahmins should be examined by the state. It's almost like a kind of version of the civil service. You need to sit examinations, you need to be regulated by the state. Certain things need to be approved, certain things disapproved. Scriptures need to be edited in order to remake Hinduism itself. And what this does, as it were, is put the focus of the state on the figure of the Brahmin to completely change that figure. What he ends up doing, as we know, after the independence of India, is taking that very advice and, as it were, switching it to the groups who would then come to be called scheduled castes, and to some degree scheduled tribes. So now, instead of the Brahmins being regulated and disciplined by the state and certified, it is Dalits and Adivasis who are meant to be, as it were, constructed as an interest group artificially in some ways through the state and by the state. So this is a way of addressing the disability, if you will, the absence of interest in a caste society by artificially creating them through the state. Of course, we know that Ambedkar eventually forsakes this mode of interest creation, and I shall come to that. But let me proceed then by saying something about how Ambedkar is shaken by Gandhi's critique of Annihilation of Caste. And indeed, he prints Gandhi's article in Young India in subsequent editions of Annihilation of Caste. He criticizes, of course, Gandhi in there. And one of the things Gandhi is saying is that low castes, in attempting to divest themselves of the history of Hinduism and make themselves anew, are doing nothing more than turning themselves into hollow men. By depriving themselves of a past, however violent, instead of trying to, as it were, reform it, what they do is leave themselves open to any adventurer who comes along, that they are actually nobodies if they separate themselves from this past, which in any case is an impossibility. And after this, as we know, Ambedkar gradually moves towards thinking about not only the annihilation of caste, but the remaking of lower castes in religious and other terms, culminating in his famous conversion to Buddhism. Right? So here is how Ambedkar talks about it. Here is a speech from 1936 to a conference attended by 35,000 Bahars, right, in Dadar in Bombay. And Ambedkar says, suppose the Hindus pass a law whereby untouchability is prohibited and its practices made punishable. Then they may ask you, we have abolished the untouchability by law and you are no longer untouchables. You are simply poor and backward, like you, other castes are equally backward. We have not provided any political safeguards for these other backward communities, then why should you be given? It will be very easy for the Muslims and the Christians to answer this question. They will say, we are not granted political safeguards and rights because we are poor, illiterate, or backward, but because our religion is different, our society is different, and so on. And so long as our religion is different, we must get our share in the political rights. This will be their appropriate reply. So long as you are living in the Hindu religion and in the Hindu society, you cannot take the stand that you are entitled for political safeguards because your society is different. So note what he's saying here, that the annihilation of caste itself is insufficient. In order for lower castes to actually constitute themselves as interest groups, if you will, they have to represent something more. They cannot simply be understood as interest groups negatively because of their disabilities. There must be, in his terms, a cultural or religious or some other element that defines them as an interest group, that makes them in some senses permanent, like Christians and Muslims. And this is one of the reasons why he advocates a conversion. There are many reasons for it, of course, but what interests me is how the issue of conversion fits in to his thinking about interests. Now, throughout this period, Ambedkar also goes on to think historically about the problem of interest in caste society. He wants to trace the origins of India's loss of interest and therefore, and also nationality, by making caste central to this explanation. So let me cite some of his ideas from this historical exploration that Ambedkar writes in his manuscript Revolution and Counter-Revolution in Ancient India. Brahmanism, he says, intended to paralyze the non-Brahmins for action against Brahmins. It did not signal that they as a nation should be paralyzed for action against a foreign nation. But the result of the position of the poison of caste has been that they have been stricken for action against Brahmanism as well as against foreigners. In other words, Brahmanism in instituting caste system has put the greatest impediment against the growth of nationalism. So here's a typical argument. What he's saying is that the caste system was meant to paralyze non-Brahmins from contesting the position of Brahmins. It was not meant to prevent an Indian nation from coming into being. Nevertheless, by modern times, the caste system prevented such a nation from coming into being. And it disabled Indian society from uniting against foreign invaders, whoever those might be. And so caste has, as he says, put the greatest impediment against the growth of nationalism itself. He continues, it has got the virtues of a family in as much as there is love and unity and mutual aid. It has got the honor known to prevail among thieves. It has got the loyalty and fraternal feeling we meet with in gangs, and it also possesses that sense of common interest which is found among robbers. So here he is describing the interest of the upper caste. It exists only among them. The others have been disabled. Right? But what does its existence imply? It implies the virtues of a family where there's love and unity, but the honor of thieves, the fraternal feelings of a gang, and the common interests of robbers, right? It's an interest that is based entirely upon depriving others. And he goes on, the difference between a society with the class system and a society with a caste system lies just in this, namely the class system is merely non-social, but the caste system is positively antisocial. No better explanation of this difference can be given than the one given by Professor John Dewey. According to him, everything depends upon whether the groups are isolated or associated, whether there is a reciprocity of interest between them, or whether there is a lack of reciprocity of interest. So unlike in a class society, you can never have, in his view, a reciprocity of interests between castes. So on the one hand, interest is confined only to upper castes. On the other hand, a society itself cannot therefore come into being in India, and certainly not a nation. Now, Ambedkar has a quite interesting way of thinking about the history of interest and its loss in ancient India and medieval India. And he does so by thinking of a parallelism between what he calls the Brahminical invasion of Buddhist India, because he sees Buddhist India as having been destroyed by a kind of Brahminical resurgence, and the Muslim invasion of Hindu India. And these, this is a way not necessarily of providing, as it were, a correct history, but of engaging with existing historical narratives and, as it were, twisting and turning them so as to allow us to see them quite differently, right? So what he's doing here is taking the existing narrative of, as it were, the Muslim invasion of Hindu India and twinning it with the prior Brahminical invasion of Buddhist India, and to see how they look in parallel. So what he says is that the Muslim invasion of Hindu India was in part made possible, of course, because of the lack of a potential national unity and a lack even of social unity made possible by the caste system. On the one hand, this was a familiar argument that caste had made India vulnerable. Right? But more than this, what he says is that the Muslim invasion actually includes Brahmins within the new dispensation. They are given honored positions, they are recognized, they become administrators, etc., for new Muslim states. The lower castes are destroyed, and Buddhism in particular is destroyed. And it's destroyed, as it were, by a combination of Muslim invaders and the prior Brahmin invaders of Buddhist India. So Buddhism is destroyed in India, but at the same time, affects both Brahminical Hinduism and Islam. How does it do that? It transforms Brahminical Hinduism into modern Hinduism, right? A modern Hinduism that is now characterized by temples, by idols, and by vegetarianism, and the idea of nonviolence. So Hinduism, even as it triumphs over Buddhism, actually inherits a great deal of it. And that is the only reason why it, as it were, survives in this way. Similarly, the Buddhists who have been destroyed by Brahmanism convert to Islam, in his view. Right? So here you have simultaneously the defeat of Buddhism by a combination of, as it were, Brahminical Hindus and Muslim invaders on the one hand, but at the same time, the survival of Buddhism within these two, if you will, enemy groups. Right? And so in spinning out this narrative, in a way, what Ambedkar is doing is saying that you cannot think of the Muslim invasion, or indeed of the destruction of Buddhism, separately. And you cannot think of them simply as a Hindu-Muslim issue. They are mediated by caste and mediated by Buddhism as an anti-caste movement. But there is more to this narrative, and Ambedkar returns to it in the figure of disinterestedness represented by the bhikshu as opposed to the Brahmin. So I'll read you some passages, but I want to remember what he has said about the figure of the Brahmin earlier, that the Brahmin reserves and arrogates interest to himself and therefore disallows its operation elsewhere among others in society. The Buddhist bhikshu is the opposite, right? Who represents disinterest, and as it were, he goes back to that earliest figure in that passage I read from Ambedkar's evidence to the Southborough Commission of the Dalit as someone who represents the interests of humanity itself, precisely because he has no interest. Right? So here are these passages. The Buddhist order of bhikshus and the Vedic order of Brahmins were designed to serve the same purpose. They formed the elite of their society whose function was to lead and guide society along the right road. Although designed to discharge the same function, the Buddhist bhikshu was better placed to discharge it than the Brahmin. That is because Buddha recognized one thing which nobody either before him or after him has done. Buddha realized that for a person to give a true lead to society and be its trustworthy guide, he must be intellectually free, and further, which is more important, to be intellectually free, he must not have private property. So already by removing private property, he removes the possibility of interest. Right? He continues, the bhikshus formed an intellectual class. The Brahmins formed, on the other hand, merely an educated class. There is a great difference between an intellectual class and an educated class. An intellectual class has no limitations arising out of any affiliations to any class or any interest. A purely intellectual class, free to consider general good and having no interest of a class to consider, such as the one contemplated by Buddha, is not to be had anywhere. For the limitations resulting from property on the freedom of intellect of the elite have not been generally recognized until very recently. But this want of an intellectual class has been made good in other countries by the fact that in those countries, each strata of society has its educated class. There is safety, if no definite guidance, in the multiplicity of views expressed by different educated classes drawn from different strata of society. So what's going on here? He says the thing about Brahmins is precisely because they colonize interest and they represent interest in Indian society to the exclusion of anyone else. They disallow its generalization, and they disallow both the making of society and social solidarity, which he calls nationalism. Right? But more than this, they disallow the Brahmins themselves from representing what he calls an intellectual class. So there is no side, they themselves can never represent disinterest or disinterestedness, something that is required even in a society of interest. The Buddhist bhikshu, precisely because the bhikshu had no relationship to class interests or caste interests, and no relationship to private property, could represent disinterestedness. And you can see where I'm going here, I hope. I'm trying to connect up the figure of the bhikshu as a figure of disinterest to the idea of the Dalit as a figure without interest, and therefore as a representative of humanity itself. How a disability institutionalized in the Constitution. On the other hand, he seems to want to go in the other direction of thinking about disinterestedness of a site where interest did not actually work. Right? Now, the lack of interest that allowed for Buddhism's destruction, because it was, in Ambedkar's view, precisely the virtue of the bhikshu as having no interest, as not being tied to a caste, that allowed them to be destroyed, but allowed the Brahmins to survive. So the ambiguity is really quite striking here. He seems to be torn between the desire to produce interests where they did not exist, or at least to generalize them, to break apart the Brahminical form of interest and generalize it. And on the other hand, to think about the possibility of a society that included a site of disinterest if it did not combat interest altogether. And so he moves from this early idea from 1919 of the Dalit as a representative of, as it was, the species being of the human race, precisely because the Dalit has no access to property and interest, to the figure of the proletariat, the Marxist or Leninist proletariat, as also one without property and therefore in some ways without interest. And this goes back, as I said, to Marx's idea of species being, though to my knowledge, Ambedkar doesn't use that term. So while he is, as it were, competing with Brahmanism to generalize interest in Indian society, to make a liberal democratic society possible, by destroying caste and so generalizing interest or creating interest institutionally, that is the Ambedkar we tend to know of, right, from Indian historiography. Here, what he's doing is elaborating his ideas on the bhikshu as a figure of disinterestedness that, as I said, go back to his words on the disinterestedness of the figure of the Dalit in the Southborough Commission. And in doing so, in this elaboration, it is not Brahmanism that is of interest to Ambedkar. He has set it aside. He has moved beyond it. It is now communism. Because you see how the figure of the bhikshu as a disinterested figure without property is to be contrasted to the figure precisely of the proletariat without property, representing the interests of humanity as such. And so in a speech in Delhi, at the Buddha Vihar in Delhi in 1956, very late, Ambedkar says, any religion that cannot provide an answer to communism will not survive. The only religion, in my view, that can serve as an antidote to communism is Buddhism. Now, I will not go into Ambedkar's critique of communism, which is very trenchant indeed, and you will get it in his works such as the Buddha or Karl Marx. But what I want to do is to end with this brief quotation to show that towards the end of his life, Ambedkar has intellectually, I would speculate, moved past the critique of Brahmanism. Not that he doesn't see a long struggle that continues to be necessary in terms of what you call the annihilation of caste, but he's not trapped within that struggle intellectually. He has turned the figure of the bhikshu, the Buddhist bhikshu, and through the Buddhist bhikshu, the propertyless and potentially disinterested Dalit, to face communism, and not just communism, but in facing communism, reading the Dalit struggle globally. So this is no longer a question of the local problems of India, or indeed of Brahminical Hinduism. There is something much more involved here, that the very victimization of the Dalit allows for the rethinking of interest and the elaboration of a politics of disinterest that criticizes, if you will, or at least places limits upon the very politics of interest that Ambedkar has otherwise conducted through his career. So I do not want to suggest that Ambedkar develops a politics of interest, which he then throws away for a disinterest. What I'm suggesting is that there are two sides of his critique or his analysis, and they are not unified into one homogeneous theory, precisely because they are meant to, as it were, be limiting of each other. This is a way of thinking about politics at two levels, and it is never clear, at least to me, whether Ambedkar sees the figure of disinterest as embodied in the bhikshu or the propertyless Dalit, how should I put it, in specific terms, that there should be a site of such disinterest in society, whereas everything else is about interest, or whether this site of disinterest is meant to serve as a vanguard and expand its reach throughout society so as to destroy interest itself as the fundamental category of liberal and democratic politics. That remains, to me at least, an open question, and I shall end there.
Thank you very much, sir, for this very interesting lecture on very interesting, of we can say a figure of our independence struggle, Dr. Ambedkar. My question to you is: you have written about Gandhi and you have also written about Ambedkar. In today's India, how do you see and contrast the ideas of Gandhi and Ambedkar? And is there a common point between these two different ideologies or thought processes?
Well, as I was suggesting, perhaps from the 1920s onwards into the 40s, there is a debate in India. There are many debates, of course, but the one that interests me here is the debate over interest, the category of interest. Now, and Gandhi and Ambedkar engage with each other in that debate. In that sense, they share the terms of that debate, but their arguments are very different, though they appear to be similar in some ways. So Gandhi too thinks as I began by saying, that interest cannot be the fundamental feature of moral or political life in India, in part because property does not, he thinks, define social relations in India, and it would be a process of great violence to force that kind of order based on interest to come into being. So what he recommended then is focusing on existing social relations in India, which he thought were defined more by duty and sacrifice than by self-interest. And that self-interest, rather than being a site of freedom, was actually precisely what allowed India to be colonized. That it was the desire of Indians for English manufactures, that sort of thing, that allowed them to acquiesce in the colonization, because self-interest in Gandhi's view tends to be, as it were, a form of cowardice rather than courage. Right? Courage always requires disinterestedness. So he has this view of things, and Ambedkar, to some degree, shares this idea of the unavailability of interest as something that subtends Indian social relations. But of course, he has a completely different explanation for it. For him, this is because caste has rendered interest impossible by locating it exclusively in the figure of the Brahmin. And in doing so has made Indian society both fragmented and porous and vulnerable, and not indeed even a society at all. So what he wants to do is, unlike Gandhi, both to break open the logic of interests, as it were, but also, as I've tried to argue, to move beyond them, but quite differently from Gandhi. Though he appears to track Gandhi quite closely in some respects. So, Gandhi, of course, is interested in religion and abandons politics, at least formal institutional politics, for religion and the social. And Ambedkar seems to do the same thing later in his career. He quits Nehru's cabinet, he converts to Buddhism, he works in society. So there are certain superficial similarities, but the differences are, I would argue, greater. And of course, there are other Indian political figures whom I did not speak about today, who are also part of this debate. If you take someone like Jinnah or someone like Savarkar, they also face this problem of disinterest or the loss or lack of or absence of political and indeed even economic interests in Indian society. But their answers are to actually rev up the engine of interest and institute interests where they do not exist. Through partition in Jinnah's case and the making of a new nation, in Savarkar's case, through the making of a Hindu nation, in a way that also implied the dismantling of caste to some degree. And there are others, right? So this is a debate that is conducted by all kinds of people in the India of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And what I find somewhat astonishing is that it seems no longer to be a debate in today's India, that we have perhaps so naturalized the idea of interest. So when every Indian election, whether at the state level or at the union level that occurs, all the analysis is about pre-given interests. This caste, this subcaste, this community, this, and they're all put together pell-mell. There are social classes or economic classes, there are castes, there are religious groups, there, all of them come together, but we assume that they all have interests. That disinterest is never factored into the analysis, um, even though it sometimes manifests itself in the very heart of what we take to be interest politics, in sacrificial, in what Gandhi might have called sacrificial movements, that not only sacrifice the lives of their members, uh, but that sometimes sacrifice, uh, perhaps even deliberately, uh, the very interests that they claim to represent.
Yeah. So this brings me to the question that we always talk about Ambedkar's political ideas, or the social ideas, but uh, we sometimes forget that he holded degrees from the London School of Economics in economics. So can you throw some light on Ambedkar's economic ideas, and do you think that they are still relevant in today's India?
Uh, there's, Ambedkar, some of his early work has to do with the Indian rupee. That is not a subject that I'm competent to write about. But of course, when you look at Ambedkar, from what I have said today, you can see already that he's very interested in the problem of property and of private property and the loss or lack of private property, uh, and what that produces. Right. So that is, uh, and as I argued, what he does through the Constitution is take the forms of state regulation that in Annihilation of Caste he had meant to be applied to Brahmins, and as it were, turn them and apply them to uh, scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, who are therefore produced by the state itself as an interest. So he's not one of those thinkers who imagines that interests, say economic interests, pre-exist. They have to be created. That's one thing. Uh, at independence, of course, Ambedkar is also much more favorable to Nehru's line on economic development, as far as I can tell, and very much opposed to the Gandhian idea of village republics and an economic policy directed primarily and in the first instance towards peasants in villages and village self-sufficiency. So that side of Ambedkar is very much attuned to a big state that forcibly transforms Indian society economically and socially. Um, but apart from that, uh, it's not clear what happens, because insofar as he ends up criticizing private property altogether and advocating for the disinterest of the bhikshu, there's something else going on there. Whether I'm not sure whether Ambedkar had the time to elaborate, as it were, a vision of what an Indian society which possessed an important site of disinterest within it would look like. Or maybe he continued with this very political antagonism within his own thought. That you must, on the one hand, go full tilt in creating interests where they didn't exist, and on the other hand, at the same time, think about disinterest as an important social category, represented either by the bhikshu or the Dalit, or indeed through the figure of the outcast, and directed against communism, as something that allows the human race itself to take its place as an actor, a potential actor in a future society. So that doesn't, I'm afraid, answer your question, but I cannot really go into the fortunes of the Indian rupee of the early 20th century.
Yeah. So we have some audience questions, sir, and this one is from Kanha Prasad, and his question is: You described Ambedkar's reinvention of the Lockean idea of interest, but to what extent did Ambedkar reinvent the ideas of the French Revolution by associating them with the Buddha? Can we compare the Brahmin in Ambedkar's thought to the role of clergy in the French Revolution?
That's very interesting. Um, I suppose, insofar as Ambedkar in his historical work plays with a number of comparisons and analogies, um, that relationship can be made. Because if you take the French Revolution, the idea of the estates, with the clergy, of course, being one. Uh, so, it bears comparison with caste, but of course, the clergy and as I think Ambedkar would argue, in Christian European society, did not play the role of uh, the Brahmin in Indian society. And he thought that this was, if not unique, certainly worthy, certainly very distinctive. That the Brahmin is more powerful than the king, in Ambedkar's view. Uh, and it is the Brahmin who makes all other castes as legitimate and possible. But this is not necessarily true of the clergy, either before or during the French Revolution, where it is the monarchy that really, and the idea of the absolute monarch that defines the ancien regime. And it is with the fall of the monarchy that everyone else can either fall or be transformed. And of course, Ambedkar is not the only one to note in this time that uh, India never becomes an absolute monarchy. When you think about historical genealogies of the modern, this is one of the, as it were, stereotyped stages. Right? So when you look at someone like Jagannath Sarkar, the historian of Mughal India, but also of Maratha India, one of the things he's arguing, and he's a contemporary of Ambedkar, one of the things he's arguing is that what was terrible was that the Mughals never managed to become an absolute monarchy in the way that Britain and France did. Because had they done so, they would have, as it were, made a nation, unified the state, given it integrity, and then they would have gone in the way that the French monarchy went, but the Indian nation would have emerged whole from within the carapace of the absolutist state. But for someone like Sarkar, that did not happen. It was a tragedy that it did not happen. So on the one hand, he would have liked the Mughals to be, as it were, even more absolutist than they were. But on the other hand, he thinks that had they contributed this to India, we could have dispensed with them and actually ended up with a unified Indian nation. So these ideas that are worked through examples such as the French Revolution are important for any number of thinkers at the time. So I think in both senses, for Ambedkar, the absolutist monarchy would have been impossible anyway in a decentralized system whose greatest source of meaning is given by the Brahmins, right? That you cannot have that kind of system with Brahminism. That is the point, because an absolute monarchy would allow for a certain kind of forcible social solidarity that he thought Indian society lacked, and it lacked it because of Brahminism. There's something, of course, extraordinarily, whether or not this is historically true, this is neither here nor there, but there is something intellectually remarkable, here. That is to say, we are being asked to think about a society that is constituted in such a way as to not require a state for its integrity, if it has any integrity, that is to say. It certainly has staying power. It has a kind of conservative force, if not integrity. That does not require a nation, that does not require, commonly understood bonds of solidarity to exist. And yet we are told that it has existed in this way for hundreds of years, if not millennia. And that is what is extraordinary. As I said, keeping aside the historical accuracy, even as an experiment in political thought, this is really interesting. How do you think of this kind of polity, if you can even call it a polity?
Yeah. So next question, we'll take two last questions because it's already 1 hour. And so this question is from Harsha Vardhan Elluri, and his question is: his critique on Brahmanism was essential during colonial times, as he was assertive for more egalitarian society, and after 1950, he is more bothered about liberal ideas, as he thought that the new republic would serve the depressed classes, and hence not focus much on critique of Brahmanism. Do you agree with this view?
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, as you know, what I've tried to suggest in my talk is that uh, without minimizing the continuing struggle for emancipation uh, in India in terms of caste oppression, Ambedkar has intellectually departed it in some ways, or at some times, uh, because and what he has done is to take from Indian history and politics an idea of both oppression and freedom that he can understand and contextualize now globally. And this is where Marxism comes in, as I was saying. It's not that Ambedkar suddenly becomes a dyed-in-the-wool conservative who hates communism because he's a religious, it's not, that is too crude a way of thinking about it. There is something far more interesting going on here, which has to do with the proletariat as a vanguard of humanity on the one hand, um, and the bhikshu via the figure of the disinterested Dalit as another way of thinking about, if you will, a vanguard of humanity in terms of embodying disinterested self. Whether this disinterest is meant to be embodied by the figure of the bhikshu alone or by others remains unclear to me. So yes, there is a way in which what Ambedkar has done is provincialized the struggle against Brahmanism. That will continue, but it no longer defines uh, both, if you will, the largest remit of Dalit politics, and also the way in which caste allows you to think now globally beyond itself, as it were. It's no longer simply an ethnographic problem of Indian society. In that sense, yes.
This question is of Kahana Prasad again, and his question is: if property became the precondition to participate in politics in colonial India, and if the Vaishya caste could be said to monopolize property, how did politics take on a Vaishya character?
Well, I mean, I think there's more than one question there. It wasn't that the Vaishya castes were the only ones to enter into formal institutional politics, because, of course, there were many other groups who had either property qualifications or educational qualifications, not least Brahmins, and of course, Kshatriyas and other groups, but also Shudra groups, many Shudra groups. So, um, uh, I mean, I've written recently in the Indian press about the, as it were, the political culture of the Vaishyas and how it comes to dominate at one particular point of Indian history. So I will not repeat that, except to say that um, I find it interesting that, and this goes back to the previous question, that while Ambedkar is so critical and understandably so of Brahminism, because he thinks of it as providing meaning for all the other castes. Without the Brahmin, they would not exist. Um, he he doesn't spend so much time thinking about the Vaishyas, though when he criticizes Gandhi, he of course criticizing as a Banya, um, uh, a Banya who inflects Brahmanism, uh, but does not break with it. So to bring the question back to Ambedkar, the relative dearth of theorizing the figure of the Vaishya and the Vaishya role in politics, I think is interesting. He certainly does it through Gandhi, primarily, um, but they don't otherwise play that greater role. They do in as sort of coalitions of various kinds. Uh, you know, which castes team up at which points in Indian history. So there, Shudras, Vaishyas, Kshatriyas um, uh, get to play a kind of game of musical chairs along with Brahmins. Uh, and so that's interesting. But all I would say is that uh, uh, just returning to my own article on this subject in the Indian Express, um, you see the Vaishya role, which is both with the emergence of mass nationalism in Gandhi, and I included Jinnah and the Muslim League as well, but also and especially, of course, with the liberalization of the Indian economy in the 1990s, which happens not accidentally, uh, along with the uh, great success of Hindutva. Uh, and in Pakistan, you see similar kinds of things happening. So that really requires uh, more study.
So we'll conclude today's talk with a last question, and it is on the relevance of Ambedkar in today's India. So, as an intellectual historian, how do you see the relevance of Ambedkar's idea in today's India?
Well, he's, in many ways, he is a posthumous character in that this is something my friend and colleague at Cambridge, Dr. Shruti Kapila, says often. His importance has only grown since his death. In his own lifetime, Ambedkar was obviously a significant enough figure, uh, but for very many reasons, including the lack of access to capital, um, he was unable to engineer any great mobilization. We know that he found it difficult even to get elected. It was, his life was really a continuous struggle in that sense. Uh, but posthumously, he has gone from strength to strength, both politically, of course, uh, with the emergence of Dalit politics in particular and its success in certain parts of India, but also intellectually because of the attention that scholars have now started to give him and his ideas. So in an interesting way, Ambedkar's ideas are important not because he himself was hugely important politically. They're important intellectually in their own right and important for our times. So, unlike in that sense, he can be nicely contrasted with Gandhi. Gandhi was very important in his own lifetime, hugely important, uh, but he's much less important today to politics today. So, if you will, the intellectual interest in Gandhi and certainly the political interest in Gandhi has gone into, if not quite a tailspin, it's a kind of a gradually descending curve. Whereas for Ambedkar, it's exactly the opposite. In some senses, it's a nice reflection of his own ideas about disinterest, the figure of the big shoe and all the rest. I mean, I wonder if one can read Ambedkar as such a figure in his own right. The man who has no, as it were, political property in his own life, who therefore comes to represent something much greater uh, than interest and interest politics. And both Gandhi and Ambedkar, of course, uh, spoke to issues well beyond India or the problems of Indian society. Um, but while Gandhi is well known for this, Ambedkar is not so well known. And one of the reasons why I chose this subject to speak about is precisely to suggest, only as an opening gambit, how we might think about Ambedkar's approach to Marxism in particular as a way of thinking outside the cloister of Indian uh, caste problems.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking out time from your schedule to deliver this lecture this evening and to also answering questions from our audience. And it was truly an honor to host you and to listen to you on Ambedkar. And we hope to have you again very soon to speak on another topic or on Gandhi, another great character or a figure of our independence struggle. Thank you so much, sir. It was truly enriching and interesting to learn about Ambedkar in a very new uh, lens, through a very new lens. So thank you so much, and thank you so much everybody who joined us live this evening on Facebook. The lecture will be available on YouTube by tomorrow morning, hopefully. So those of you who missed us live can watch it later on YouTube and Facebook. Please do share it with your friends and family, and do subscribe to Carvan. Thank you so much and have a great evening.
Thank you very much. Bye.